There is a growing tension inside the Indiana Fever organization that is becoming harder to ignore.
I think that she's shooting bad because she's out of rhythm, and the system that they're running just doesn't fit for her.
On paper, the roster carries genuine potential. On the court, that potential is consistently undercut by a set of decisions that seem to work against the team's most obvious strength. At the center of it all is a player who, by nearly every measure, is the most dynamic offensive presence in the league, and a system that appears uncertain about how to use her. Caitlin Clark arrived in Indiana with a playing style that was already fully formed. She was not a project. She was not a prospect in the traditional sense. She was a finished product, a player who had demonstrated at the highest level of collegiate competition that she could function as the primary engine of an offense and produce results that most professional players never approach. The question was never whether she could perform at the next level. The question was whether the organization around her was prepared to build something that matched what she brought. Through the preseason and into the early regular season stretch, the answer to that question has been, at best, incomplete. What viewers have noticed, and what the broadcast footage confirms, is a recurring pattern in which Clark spends extended sequences off the ball, positioned on the perimeter, away from any meaningful action. There are possessions where she does not touch the ball for 3, 4, sometimes 5 consecutive plays. In those sequences, the offense tends to flatten, the pace slows, the defense settles into its preferred alignment, and Indiana, rather than pressing any kind of advantage, ends up running sets that produce the least efficient shot in basketball, the mid-range two-pointer, taken off the dribble with a hand in the face. This is not a coincidence. It is the predictable outcome of removing your most creative offensive player from the decision-making chain. The reasoning that is circulated, that moving Clark off the ball creates better looks by using screens and catch-and-shoot opportunities, reflects a fundamental misreading of what makes her effective. Clark is not a shooting guard who benefits from being freed off screens. She is a playmaker. Her value is generated through her ability to read the defense while in motion, attack the pick and roll at pace, find cutters before they arrive at their destination, and pull from distances that defenders cannot reasonably contest without abandoning their rotations. When she is static, she is approximately half the player she is when the ball is in her hands. The defense knows this, the numbers reflect this, and yet the approach has not changed. Fan commentary in the weeks since the preseason has been pointed. The frustration is not abstract, it is specific. Viewers watching live broadcasts have noted sequences where Clark stands at the three-point arc while the ball cycles through several other players, none of whom generate any real threat before the shot clock forces a contested attempt. The reaction in comment sections and social channels has been consistent. This is not working, and the people watching can see why. The issue is compounded by what is happening elsewhere on the court. Caitlin Clark's effectiveness as a playmaker depends partly on the players around her being in the right positions at the right moments. In a high-speed Clark-initiated offense, spacing is not optional, it is structural. Teammates need to be ahead of the play, filling lanes, making themselves available at the precise moment when Clark's read of the defense creates an opening. When that coordination breaks down, the passes either do not get made or they arrive to players who are not ready to receive them. This has been visible enough that it has generated its own strand of viewer criticism. Comments about specific players, including Lexi Hull and Hines Allen, have pointed to moments where assignments appeared unclear, where positioning looked uncertain, and where the gap between what Clark was trying to do and what her teammates were prepared to execute was wide enough to stall the entire possession. Hines Allen, in particular, has drawn attention after several games in which her role within the offensive structure seemed undefined. Viewers described her as appearing lost, not in the sense of poor effort, but in the sense of playing without a clear assignment in the context of what the offense was attempting to do. This matters for reasons that go beyond individual performances. When key frontcourt players are operating without defined roles in the offense, the entire system loses coherence. Clark's ability to create advantages depends on knowing where her teammates will be. If those positions are inconsistent from possession to possession, the read and react offense that she was built to run simply cannot function. You end up with a hybrid, part structured play, part improvisation, that satisfies neither approach fully and produces the kind of stagnant half-court basketball that has frustrated fans throughout this stretch of games. To looking at how other organizations have handled comparable situations provides some useful reference points. The Las Vegas Aces built their offensive identity around Aja Wilson not by asking Wilson to adapt to the system, but by designing the system around her strengths. The same principle applied when they added complementary pieces. Every personnel decision and every tactical choice was evaluated against the standard of whether it made Wilson more effective. That organizational clarity produces results. It also produces chemistry, because players understand their roles in relation to the team's central player, and they execute those roles with confidence rather than uncertainty. In Indiana, the approach has appeared less certain. There seems to be an ongoing tension between building around Clark's strengths and fitting Clark into a structure that predates her arrival and may not have been sufficiently modified to accommodate her game. The result is a team that occasionally looks dangerous, particularly in transition, where Clark's pace and vision are hardest for defenses to contain, but that consistently reverts to a slower, more deliberate half-court game that neutralizes her most valuable qualities. The transition moments are instructive precisely because they reveal what the offense looks like when structure does not constrain it. When Indiana pushes the pace after a defensive stop, when Clark has the ball in her hands with space ahead of her and decisions to make in real time, the offense comes alive. Defenses cannot set up, rotations cannot organize. And Clark, operating in the environment where she is most dangerous, finds angles and makes plays that defenders simply cannot predict or prevent. The contrast with the half-court sets is stark enough that it raises a genuine strategic question. If the offense works when it runs, why does the coaching staff keep walking it? Part of the answer may lie in defensive concerns. There is a perception, reflected in some of the coaching commentary that has emerged publicly, that playing faster increases the risk of turnovers and transition opportunities for the opposition. This is not an unreasonable concern. Clark's style of play does carry some turnover risk, particularly on the ambitious passes that are a defining feature of her game. But the trade-off calculation appears to be producing the wrong answer. The defensive lapses that come from transition play are being weighted more heavily than the offensive advantages that transition play generates. The result is a team that plays cautiously and loses ground in the process. There is also the matter of shot selection across the roster as a whole. The long two-pointer, the mid-range attempt from the vicinity of the free throw line, or slightly beyond, inside the three-point arc, remains the most inefficient shot in basketball by the relevant metrics. It yields fewer points per attempt than a three-pointer, and fewer points per attempt than a shot at the rim. Organizations that build around elite three-point shooting and rim pressure generate significantly better offensive efficiency than organizations that generate a high volume of mid-range attempts. The Fever, in this stretch of games, have produced a troubling volume of exactly those shots. And this is happening on a roster that includes shooters capable of stretching the floor, and a primary ball handler who shoots three-pointers at an elite level, from distances that most defenders are not prepared to contest. The spacing issue contributes to this problem. When the floor is not properly spaced, when players are clustered in areas that allow the defense to pack the lane and extend out to shooters simultaneously, the available options on each possession shrink. Drives are contested earlier. Three-point attempts come off the catch with less separation, and the mid-range shot becomes the default, not because it is the best option, but because it is the only shot that the structure of the possession allows. Fixing the shot selection problem requires fixing the spacing problem, and fixing the spacing problem requires giving Clark the ball and the authority to organize the offense from the position where she is most effective. The defensive identity question adds another layer of complexity. This year's Fever roster includes players added specifically for their defensive contributions, athletes with the motor and the length to be disruptive in ways that last year's group was not. Raven Johnson has drawn particular praise for her defensive energy and her ability to create pressure at the point of attack. These additions address a genuine weakness, but the integration of a more defensively focused roster has, at least in this early stretch, come with an offsetting cost on the offensive end. Teams that emphasize defensive discipline tend to play more conservatively on offense as well, not because one requires the other, but because the same organizational culture that produces defensive cohesion often produces offensive caution. The players who are best at executing structured defensive schemes are often the same players who are most comfortable operating within structured offensive schemes, even when those schemes are suboptimal. The tension between Clark's instinctive read and react style and the more disciplined framework that the coaching staff appears to prefer is real, and it has not yet been resolved in a way that allows the offense to function at the level that the talent on the roster should produce. There's a broader historical pattern here that deserves attention. In both men's and women's professional basketball, teams that acquire transformational playmakers and then fail to reorganize their offensive identity around those players tend to produce the same outcome. Years of underperformance, followed by either a belated adjustment or a separation that benefits the player more than the organization. The list of franchises that mismanaged early years of elite players is long, and the common thread running through all of those situations is an organizational resistance to changing the way things had always been done. Indiana does not have unlimited time to work through this. The WNBA season is short. The regular season standings matter for playoff seeding in ways that cannot be easily recovered from a slow start. And perhaps more importantly, the professional window for any player, even a historically exceptional one, is finite. The years when a player is performing at their peak and has the physical capacity to carry an offense are not unlimited. Every season that is spent in a suboptimal system is a season that does not come back. The commentary from fans watching these games reflects an awareness of this dynamic. The frustration is not simply about individual possessions or individual games. It is about the accumulating sense that an opportunity is being mishandled, that a team with a legitimate chance to be exceptional is settling for something considerably less, and that the reasons for that gap are correctable if the organization has the willingness to correct them. The practical adjustments are not complicated. They do not require wholesale roster changes or a complete tactical overhaul. They require a clearer commitment to a few specific principles. Clark needs to initiate the offense from the position where she is most dangerous, at the top of the key or in the short roll off a pick and roll, with the ball in her hands and a decision to make. The pace needs to reflect the advantage that Clark creates in transition rather than defaulting to a half-court game that eliminates that advantage. The shot selection needs to shift away from mid-range attempts and toward attempts at the rim and from the three-point line. And the spacing needs to give Clark room to operate, which means her teammates need to be positioned in ways that pull defenders out of the lane and onto the perimeter. None of these adjustments requires abandoning defensive discipline. Elite teams play good defense and run efficient offenses simultaneously. The premise that playing faster or giving Clark more offensive authority necessarily compromises the defensive end is not supported by evidence from the teams that have done it successfully. It is a constraint that exists primarily in the assumptions being applied to the situation, not in the situation itself. What the coaching staff decides to do with the remaining games of this stretch will be telling. Adjustments during the course of a season are normal. The ability to recognize that a plan is not working and to change course accordingly is a core function of coaching at any level. The question is whether that recognition has occurred, and whether the adjustments that follow reflect a genuine recalibration or a surface-level modification that preserves the essential features of an approach that has not produced results. The players watching Clark operate at less than full capacity, and the viewers watching from outside can see the version of this team that exists when the system works. It surfaces in individual possessions, in moments of transition offense, in the sequences where Clark has the ball and the space to make plays. Those moments are not random. They are the predictable output of giving a talented playmaker the conditions she needs to function. The task for the organization is to make those conditions the default rather than the exception. What happens in Indiana over the next several weeks carries implications beyond the current season. The Fever's front office has made decisions in the draft, in free agency, in the coaching structure that reflect a long-term vision for the franchise. Whether that vision is executable depends in significant part on whether the organization can demonstrate that it is capable of building around its primary asset rather than limiting her. A franchise that shows it can maximize a generational talent attracts other talent. It creates the kind of organizational credibility that allows a team to compete at the highest level on a consistent basis. A franchise that wastes those years earns a different kind of reputation, one that is considerably harder to shed. The WNBA is at a moment of genuine growth. League visibility is expanding. Attendance figures, broadcast numbers, and commercial interest have all moved in directions that reflect a broader recognition of the product's quality and the player's caliber. In that environment, the stakes attached to organizational decisions are higher than they were even a few years ago. Teams that build correctly in this window will benefit from the league's growth. Teams that do not will find the gap between the top and the middle of the league widening in ways that are difficult to reverse. Indiana is positioned by virtue of having drafted the player who has done more than anyone to drive the league's current visibility to be one of the primary beneficiaries of that growth. But that position is not guaranteed. It requires execution. It requires the organizational willingness to make the player at the center of that visibility as effective as possible. and to build the team around her in a way that produces wins. The fans watching these games are not asking for anything complicated. They are asking for the version of this team that the talent on the roster should be capable of producing. They are asking for the ball to be in the right hands at the right moments. They are asking for role clarity, for players to know their assignments within the context of what the offense is attempting to do, so that the disconnects and miscommunications that have defined too many possessions in this stretch of games are replaced by the kind of coordinated action that produces efficient basketball. That is a reasonable ask, and the people responsible for delivering it have both the information and the capacity to respond to it. The question is whether they will. The conversation around this team will continue regardless of what happens next. The scrutiny that comes with having the most watched player in the league is not going away. Every possession, every coaching decision, and every personnel choice will be analyzed in real time by an audience that is paying close attention and is not inclined to be patient with avoidable mistakes. That level of attention is, in one sense, a resource. It means that the franchise has a platform that most organizations in this league do not. The way that platform is used, whether it is leveraged into something substantial or squandered through organizational missteps, will define the legacy of this period in the franchise's history. There is still time to get this right. The season is not over. The adjustments that need to be made are identifiable and achievable. The talent required to execute them is present on the roster. What is needed now is the clarity of vision and the organizational commitment to act on what the evidence clearly shows, that this team is better, more dangerous, and more capable of winning when it gives Caitlin Clark the ball, trusts her to make plays, and builds the structure of the offense around her strengths rather than around a framework that was designed before she arrived. That is the decision in front of the Indiana Fever. It is not a complicated one. The cost of getting it wrong, however, is considerable, and the window to get it right is shorter than it may appear.